Hey, you're listening to Blindsight. Let's go. Mental health isn't something to take lightly. It's time to fight. It's time to thrive. Let's do this.
Hello there. Welcome to Blindsight. This is your host, Bill Lundgren. And as always, I'm delighted to have you listening in. And today is going to be, I think, a very important subject. That is family dynamics. And we're going to have Jonathan chime in. The two of us will be talking about family dynamics. And one of the reasons I wanted to do that show now is that I just last week found out about a longtime good friend and colleague suddenly died of a heart attack. And I wanted to dedicate this show to him because he was the one who introduced me to the whole thing about family dynamics when he gave a lecture. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that, but I wanted to, acknowledge Ed Ellis's death. He was a psychologist, died in Florida, and I will miss him sorely. The other thing is I want to make sure that you know about our new program, new podcast coming up. I won't be involved, but Jonathan is pulling it together. It's called Game Changer, and it'll be on Blind Sports, and that'll be great stuff, I'm sure. We want to remind you if there's a program that you'd like to see us talk about, or you want to raise some questions or even give us kudos, we're always glad for that. There are two ways. One is there's a telephone line that's you dial 720-712-8856, and that's the feedback line. The other way, you can send us an email at feedback@aftersight.org, and we'll get it, and we'll add it to our information, and we'll thank you very much for a response. Okay, Jonathan, I wanted to get going on family dynamics and welcome you on board again.
Thanks. It's fun to be on.
Okay, great. Now, you, of course, came from a functional family.
Yeah. Yes, I did. It was in our modern day culture, you would call it that functional family. So yes, it was. Well, it's very different.
There was a New Yorker cartoon a while ago where it was an audit. The artist was drawing an auditorium from the back of the auditorium facing the stage, and there were one or two people sitting in the audience. There was nobody on stage, and there was a banner over the stage that said, "Welcome to the annual meeting of children of functional families."
Nice.
As I said, I was introduced to the whole idea of taking a look at family dynamics by my friend Ed when he gave a lecture back in the days when it was just starting to talk about adult children of alcoholics. Mm-hmm. And Ed was an adult child as well as being a recovering alcoholic himself. Mm-hmm. And I went to support him because there's no alcoholism in my family that I was aware of in my immediate family. And I listened to him. And as I heard him talk about the family dynamics and so forth, all of a sudden I said, "Oh," and I won't tell you the four-letter word that followed the O. He's talking about my family. And while there was not alcoholism in the family, the dynamics that he was, this dysfunctional dynamics that he was describing were very much tied with within my family. And, I may say a little bit more about that, but we want to start off by saying a couple things as disclaimers. One is we're not doing a parental bashing.
Right. Yep.
Our parents did not stay up all night trying to figure out how to screw us up.
No, I certainly. I'm gonna leave that there. I'm just gonna leave that right there.
Well,
I ain't touching that one until later, Bill.
Well,
the
thing is, Jonathan, our parents. When I work, first time I meet with a couple, I tell them, the three of us are in this office, but in addition to the three of us, there are four other people who are standing behind you. And I point and I say, look at one and say, your parents. And I looked at the other of a couple and say, and your parents.
Mm-hmm.
Because they were only operating on what they knew. And they raised us thinking that was the right way to go. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they were right and sometimes they weren't. And in my case, in my mother's case, she was a very bright woman in some areas, but she got a hold of Dr. Spock's book. And I'm not talking about the guy on Star Trek. I'm talking about the pediatrician who was very famous in putting out books on how to raise your children. And she tried to raise her children according to Dr. Spock. And years afterward, Dr. Spock apologized for some of the suggestions that he made to parents. Mm-hmm. And my older sister, who was the victim of that information, never forgave our mother for some of the things that she did, but she was just following the rule books.
Sure. Yep.
And we don't, I don't think even now we have to search out parental training, because we just don't. I think it should be in schools, frankly, but that's my own opinion. And what happens then is parents are following their parents' rules, or as with one writer I've been reading now, she said, I'm not going to raise the kids the way my parents did. And she didn't. But then those kids got into trouble because she was going at the opposite extreme.
Yes.
Now, one of the frameworks I want to give people is a continuum. And the continuum is, we call the enmesh family. That's the family where one person in the family sneezes and somebody else in the family gets a cold. And
never heard that before.
Yeah, well, it's so true, because they are so involved with each other. Sometimes it's very difficult when they marry to bring somebody in, because the family is so caught up in each other.
Yeah.
Then on the other end of the spectrum is what we call the detached family. That is, they're in the same building, they say hello to each other, but they're really very, very not caught up in the other family members. They're off doing their own thing.
Yeah.
And that's a continuum. And most of us fall somewhere in there. And depending on how healthy we are, maybe in the center, where we kind of have a balance between the enmeshment and the detachment. But that's not always easy to achieve. And so the result of that kind of upbringing, that's what we know. So that when we become parents, we follow, either do the opposite, or we do what our parents did, and with sometimes unhappy results. Mm-hmm. Then we have circumstances that may add into it, like, for example, a physical disability in either the parent or the child, and that kind of alters the dynamics of the family.
Yes, very much.
Yeah. Now, what I want to do is kind of focus on the alcoholic family because it's a pretty well studied and well known, and we've moved out of talking about the alcoholic family to the dysfunctional family to kind of take a look at the way that the family patterns develop and to take a look at it. Now, there is a Murray Bowen, who was a very early family therapist, had the position that if a parent came in talking about a problem child, he wouldn't see the child because he said if I can get the parent healed, the child will get better.
That's right.
I don't have to deal with the kid, which was one way of looking at it. But let's look at the alcoholic family. Now, let's just for stereotype, I'll say the dad is an alcoholic. Mom is what we call the codependent or the co-alcoholic, and the dad has, if he's really in the alcoholism, he's very dysfunctional. It may be working, but, when he comes home, he's under the influence. And, he sometimes he's happy, sometimes he's angry, sometimes he's all kinds of things. And mom is the one who tries to compensate for dad. In other words, over cares, over responds to keep the family going and in fact gets her goodies if she's managing to keep the family going. I've had situation where I worked with the dad and got him sober, and then the wife left him and married another alcoholic because it was so many goodies that she was getting from being the caretaker. And we find this too with someone who takes care of someone who's blind or someone who physically disabled. They get a lot of goodies and sometimes take over and don't let the person with the disability try to have some kind of independence. So it's the same kind of dynamic. So now in this family where you have mom and dad dysfunctional, let's say just for explanation purpose, you have 3 kids. Now, one of the things about children is, number one, when real early, they're narcissistic and they see the world as revolving around them.
Correct.
Which has a side viewpoint, which is they believe in magical thinking that they can make the world work. And they're acutely aware that if the big people are unhappy, they may be abandoned. So their job is to keep the big people happy. And when someone who's a real a child of an alcoholic will be constantly scanning to see, is it safe? Is it, are the big people happy? And will do whatever it can to keep the big people happy. Sure. And they may do something that makes their dad laugh. And so they put that in their repertoire, and they may do the same thing the next day, and dad may be in a bad mood, and they might get yelled at. So it gets very confusing for them for that person to figure out what he's supposed to do. So he's constantly trying. In a multi-children household, that tends to fall upon the hero. The firstborn we call the hero, tend to call the hero, because their job is to make the family look good. They become, in my older sister's case, she was the one that did not have a disability. And she had to excel in school, and she was the one who was supposed to take care of us and make sure we didn't get into trouble, my sister and I. And if we caused some uproar, she got yelled at because she wasn't watching us. And she exceeded, became valedictorian, the whole thing of showing how wonderful the family was.
Yep.
Now, with that hero role taken, there isn't anything for the second child.
Mm-hmm.
So the second child may choose, or with that unconsciously, to become the scapegoat, to cause trouble, cause uproar. The oftentimes become what we call the identified patient. And that scapegoat is really the
Yeah.
most loyal member of the family because they're holding the family together by taking attention away from the dysfunction of the parents.
Yes.
And then in a 3-member family or a 4-member family, the hero and the scapegoat role are taken. So the other children have to figure out where they are. And in my case, I became more than anything the mascot. That is, I was the one who would make the family laugh, and I still do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And or they may become the lost child who's off in the corner, doesn't cause any trouble, and just completely is not part of the family, but is the observer. And in my case, I was that as well. So these become very much a survival skills. And what really becomes problematic is when they grow up and they maintain the same style. In other words, they're the hero of work, and oftentimes they're the ones become alcoholics because they're constantly, doing everything they can to make a success of themselves. And the scapegoat, obviously, is the one that gets into trouble. And all these roles become really dysfunctional because they become ossified in how these people operate unless somebody intervenes like a therapist or it becomes real clear this is not working. And what fascinated me working with alcoholics as I was back in that time, I would get one child, let's say the alcoholic, the scapegoat, get the scapegoat sober, and the scapegoat becomes the hero of the family. And guess what? Somebody else in the family starts to act out. The dynamics was so set that somebody had to be a scapegoat, and so the role would go on to somebody else. And so I know that this pattern, which was actually developed by a group of recovering people, a therapist, who were children of alcoholics, and they got together and they started to map out and said, Claudia Black and Timon Cermak and some of the others, and said, oh, there's a pattern that we all have. And that's when they began to develop this idea of alcoholic families, which has, of course, morphed into understanding that it isn't just alcoholics that establish this kind of pattern. And this is important for us to be aware of, if we come from a dysfunctional home. And a friend of mine said, I consider dysfunctional and family to be a redundancy. And, she had a point.
Yeah.
And this is the thing. And the sad thing is, I don't know that we're doing that much to change the system to teach people how to have a healthy family. Fortunately, there are a lot of healthy families around. It's just we don't notice them because they're not getting into trouble.
Right. It's kind of like in football, the offensive line doesn't usually get any recognition unless there's a penalty called on them, and then it's all the negative attention.
Yeah, exactly. And so the question becomes, how do we change the system? How do we get people to change the family dynamics? And certainly the first thing is for people to recognize that these patterns, I know I had to change when I saw where I was in in this whole dynamic. Then, interestingly enough, my scapegoat sister also became a counselor.
Oh,
That's how we did, how we began to understand and to change the dynamics for ourselves. Now, our hero sister still tried to be the hero. She also became a hypochondriac because we were getting all that attention as deaf children. So it's how, when you look at your family, it's really helpful to take a look at what roles people take and also to say, okay, do I want to operate that way? And sometimes it's real difficult. But if we can ask ourselves, well, wait a minute, am I continuing a role I had as a kid and do things like never take a vacation, never take time off, or and trying always for everyone to praise me and so forth? Is that what I really want? Or am I doing it out of a pattern that was established a long time ago?
right.
And I can voluntarily change it. And I think the identification is the thing that comes first. You realize that's what you're doing, and that's a pattern. And that was the aha moment for me. And I think it's the aha moment for a lot of people when they say, oh, that's why I do this. Because this is all automatic. And your parents are operating in maybe dysfunctional ways. It's automatic for them because that's how they survived in their family. And you go back several generations and you begin to understand, oh, they didn't willfully carry out this way of operating. They were trained to be that way. And you begin to get out of the stigma of, in a sense, the stigma is functioned by saying, oh, I realize where it comes from and I need to do something different. And that ain't easy.
No.
And, it's like I tell people, if you think about I'll ask you, Jonathan, when you put on a coat, which arm do you put in the coat first?
My right arm.
Okay. So for the next couple of weeks, I want you always to put your left arm in the coat first. Yep. How easy is that going to be?
Not easy.
Yeah. And so that's the dilemma that we have, is being able to change a pattern which is so automatic. And oftentimes and I think a lot of families don't like to admit, my mom was an alcoholic or my dad was abusive. And particularly around abuse, it's a surprise to clients when I say, your father was abusive. Oh, I thought that's the way all fathers were.
Right.
And, it's when we step back and say, okay, what did I experience? And not necessarily to have, make negative judgment, but understand that it came out of the dysfunction of our families. And we have to ask ourselves, do we want to continue that dysfunction in the next generation? Now, as I said earlier, some people say, well, I'm not going to raise my kids in the way that my parents did. And they go to the opposite extreme with equally problematic results.
Sure.
But the job really as a member of the family is to identify what went on and to be able to say, okay, this is the way I want my family to be. And then you have to go find out how you do that, especially if you haven't had any training in the area. So I've been doing all the talking, Jonathan. What are your thoughts?
Because I have a few.
Yeah.
So a little bit about my personal family history. My dad was a pastor when I was a kid and pastored for 20 years. And the thing that was interesting about our family dynamic was when my dad was, I'm gonna say attacked, and not, I mean, in like a physical way, but when the church kind of turned against him and was doing some very corrupt things, and we had people in the church who were doing some very inappropriate things and trying to kind of destroy my family.
Churches never do that.
No, ever. And says nobody ever, right? And
right.
So, but what was interesting is that type of trauma does one of two things to the family. It either promotes a circle the wagons mentality, or it destroys the family. Right. And as a pastor's kid, I saw so many things that I should never have seen as a child because of there's this perception and this reality that comes from being in that situation where, and I would equate this to children of politicians or children of public figures. You have this glass bowl effect or fishbowl effect where you are being judged and critiqued and looked at because you're either going to be set to a higher standard or you're going to be expected to do things in a particular way. And if you don't do that, you're going to be judged or criticized or critiqued for those things. So living in that pressure bubble was very different, and it's very difficult for kids. Right. However, my parents had a very good rule when it came to parenting, and it was say yes to as many things as humanly possible. No should really only be used for safety issues, for moral issues, and for spiritual issues. So if it wasn't one of those three things, you're supposed to try to say yes as much as you can. You're not going to say you're not going to say, the kid's going to be running into the street and you're going to say, "Oh yeah, go ahead. We'll let the car hit you. That's fine." Right. You're going to say no to protect them. You're going to say no to prevent them from going over to a friend's house that may have a damaging family lifestyle or somebody who could, there's a protective nature. There's a safety nature in that. The problem becomes when you start justifying those no actions with things that are in your own life that are fearful. So for instance, if I sent my son over, if my son wanted to go play over at his friend's house and I said no, is it because I'm being selfish with my time or I don't want to drive him over there? Or is it because he could get hurt over there? There's a difference there. But when you have a family dynamic that is constantly circling the wagons, it does this amazing thing where, like you were talking about at the beginning, the family kind of sneezes on each other and everybody gets sick. My family is pretty close to that. It's not that dramatic, but we're very tight-knit because of the struggles that we faced together. Exactly. And when you have an alcoholic who is in the family, you'll have something that occurs. One, the alcoholic may be removed from the family completely, whether it's the man, the wife, the son, whoever it is in the family can be removed from the family or isolated either through self-isolation or excommunication, I guess, if you will. But the other thing is that if you have a good family dynamic and you have a group, a collective family who is trying to better the family for the good of the family, for the good of the community, for the good of the individual, you have a family that is welcoming, who is caring and gracious and kind, and they want to pull in that family member into the fold so that that family dynamic can maintain itself. Right. Because if the family isolates from the individual, now you have two different conversations and two different things happening, and the integrity of the family gets lost.
You got it.
And you have this nucleus of maybe it's the mom who is a single mom now, or the single father who is trying their hardest to keep the kids together. And research has shown over and over and over and over again that children coming from two-parent households are far often more successful, more well balanced, because there is a yin and yang between a masculine and a feminine.
Mm-hmm.
And I know this is kind of bleeding into parenting territory, but the glue, you have to have those two contrasting styles balance each other out so the kids feel safe and secure no matter what. And so if a father is trying
role models
right,
that they can figure out how to fit in. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And if a father is trying to play the role of mother, like in my situation, I can be that masculine man and I can be that leader and provider for my kids, no matter how soft and how sensitive and how loving and gracious I can be. It will never compare to the nurturing love and touch that a mother can give.
Right.
Conversely, a mother can be that loving and nurturing and that come to me, gather with me, and I will protect you and love you and all those good things. It will be very hard for her to take on the burden of providing for the family because she wasn't designed that way.
Right.
That stress can crumble her. And so when you have these family dynamics that are imbalanced, everybody starts pulling weights they were never meant to pull.
Right.
And I love family dynamics. I love communication with family because it creates so many different avenues for good conversation, for healthy conversation. Right. And we all have that one aunt or uncle who is the typical, oh yeah, don't talk to him about politics. Don't talk to her about pop culture because they're going to go off the deep end. It's those people that I love the most because they have the most unfiltered opinions of anybody ever. they make life so much more interesting because to every person's opinion, there is an element of truth.
Right.
And if you can humble yourself to a specific person or an idea, you may learn something that you didn't think possible.
Yeah.
So those are some of the thoughts that I have.
But I'll tell you, I have a little bit of adjustment to what you're saying about, unfortunately, there are a lot of single parents now.
Yeah.
And what is often very helpful is when other family members can assist the primary parent in providing the kind of thing that you're talking about, like a brother or a grandfather or whatever. And that helps to bridge
it does.
some of that. It's not perfect, but under the circumstances, that is a tremendous asset. And sometimes even, I know one of the things that happened in my family is that we children sort of sought out. My mother was a single parent from the time I was 8 years old. And so we kind of sought out some of the figures that we needed to give us, as you say, that balance or that influence. And but the other piece that I did mention, but I want to bring it in now, there's also secrets.
Yep.
And the secrets can be very damaging for the family.
They can destroy families. They'll destroy a family.
And one of the biggest surprises to me, 40 years after my father died, is my mother finally told us some things about his death that we did not know. And it's circumstantial, but it's explained a lot of things. But we had that absence for 40 years of not knowing it because she thought, and even when, after my father died, she would not cry in front of us because she thought it would upset us. So she would go to a friend's house and cry. And what kind of messages, dysfunctional messages, do you think it gives to a family? So it's that thing where it's not just the role models, but also the people being honest with the kids about what's going on as much as they can handle. And my mother just went overboard. but to not to confuse the kids, but at least let the kid know what's going on.
Yeah.
And give them as much as you say, making a decision not to allow a kid to go to somebody's house. I think it's important for you to say, I'm not doing this arbitrarily. I'm concerned about XYZ. And kids can take that information. Now, your fear, of course, is, they're going to blab to the, the other party. But
right.
the point is, the secrets are going to hurt you.
Yeah, the secrets are definitely going to they can hurt. And I think that's what I was alluding to when I was talking about the integrity of a family, because the more secrets that you keep, the more damage it becomes. And then you have these little, for my family, for example, if there is a problem going on with the family, you may have like my mom and my uncle go off and talk in a room, not because they're trying to pull one over on somebody else, but because they have two very different ways of thinking.
Right.
And so then they'll take that way of thinking. And then my mom will go to my grandma and say, hey, we came up with this idea. What do you think about this? And then they'll throw that idea to somebody else. And it's not oh, did you hear what she said? And how are we going to handle this and this and this and that? We have somebody in our family who is struggling, and I want to make sure that we have a private conversation, because this needs to stay private in a particular way.
Right.
And then that can be addressed with the individual, with whomever has been deemed. Like if you're the oldest, usually it's the oldest going to the youngest, or, some sort of hierarchy dynamic, if you will. And for my family, it's if somebody is struggling with something, we'll usually all eventually have a conversation about it, maybe not all together, but it's very much a come alongside and be wind underneath that wing, and making sure that they're safe and taken cared for. Excuse me.
But Jonathan, the other thing that you're pointing out, and I think it's real important, and this is where a lot of families get into trouble, where the one parent will try to get allies from the children or a child, and that child then becomes like, the earpiece, and then they are going to feel the distress that their parents are having. And really what has to happen is the parents need to deal with these kinds of things with their peers, with their partner, and not drag the kids in and make the kid take sides.
Right. Yeah,
and
exactly.
The kids have to be kids. Mm-hmm. And when we start parentalizing a child, where they're to become the parent to mom or whatever, it really gets very dysfunctional. So it's kind of like, okay, mom and dad have to deal with this. Mm-hmm. You don't have to take sides or get involved or whatever. You can be a kid. We'll handle it. And then
and that it becomes an issue of. And I know I'm gonna burn some bridges and tick some people off. So I apologize if somebody gets triggered by this. There's a difference between my truth and the truth, capital THE. Because when you talk about the quote, my truth, that is a truth based on your circumstances, based on your evidence and your perception that may not include actual reality or actual facts.
Right.
And so like I could say, oh yeah, the sky is blue, and that could be a actual legitimate fact, or gravity is a fact. And you could say, well, I reject that reality. My perception is that the sky is purple and green and black and pink and, whatever color you want.
Right.
But your perception of it, may have been taught that that is that color. But even if that's your truth, it may not be the capital THE truth. And that's a very tough place to live when you're dealing with family dynamics, because everybody has an opinion. Everybody has a perception.
Absolutely.
And you have to separate the emotion from the facts.
Mm-hmm.
The fact is, Dad is an alcoholic. Dad has had a lot to drink and is now needing to go to rehab. Those are the facts.
Right.
He has been in hospital. He's had liver failure. He's had kidney failure. He's had all these medical issues from the alcohol. Those are plain and clear facts. The perception of, those are going to be, well, now you're going to start psychoanalyzing the dad without ever talking to him. Those are the opinions. Those are my truth. My truth is that, Dad was just having a hard day at work, so he came home and drank a little too much.
Yeah.
You start justifying it. And so when you talk about my truth versus the truth, it also bleeds into that integrity aspect for the family. And everybody has to do their part in nurturing the family together. That's why cultures like in the Hispanic culture and even the African American culture, they're so family and community oriented that everything is just brought out to light. There's no secrets. Everybody knows everything about everybody, which is something that we have lost in our Western culture.
Yeah. That and we keep trying to hide things because we want to always look good.
Yeah.
And that's really that essential looking good family is what often is very harmful to the family when things are not good and we can't reach out and say, wait a minute, this has to change, whatever it is.
Yeah, we're so busy on the idea of looking good that we don't take the time to actually be good.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We could probably talk for many, many days more, but I think this is a good place to stop. And I'd be interested if anybody contacts us and say, what about this or that? We'd love to hear from you. As I say, you can call the feedback line at 720-712-8856 or drop us a line on the email that's feedback@aftersight.org. This has been Bill Lundgren and Jonathan Price talking about family dynamics, and we'll be doing more programs, and we look forward to having you join us next time. And keep an eye out in May for Fair Play. What is it? Jonathan, what's the...
Game Changers.
Game Changers. I'll get it one of these days. Game Changers. So anyway, and then we'll see what Jonathan comes up with next as another podcast.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
So anyway, glad to have you with us. Take care.